Now, where are we today with this system? Well, it's fascinating to see, if you look at the original Constitution, that is before the Bill of Rights, Congress was given the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. Why was that there? Well, because they wanted uniformity. The one thing they had discovered when the militia called out in the War of Independence, these people showed up with arms of different, rifles of different types, or muskets, sometimes rifles, otherwise different calibers, whatever, and all sorts of logistical problems. So their organization and their arming and their discipline they wanted to make uniform. Why? Because the militia could be called into the service of the United States for three particular purposes: execute the laws of the United States, laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. Just those three purposes. Now, if you just stopped with those three purposes, that's a pretty good description of a Homeland Security program. Right? Enforcing the laws, suppressing insurrections, repelling invasions. You pretty much covered the waterfront with that. It's interesting, too, to look in the Constitution and see that no other establishment or institution is given that authority. Not the Army, not the Navy, not the Department of Homeland Security. There wasn't one under the Constitution, right? In fact, the only department that's mentioned in the Constitution is the Treasury. There's no other department mentioned. And it's also interesting, the President of the United States is given the duty under the Constitution to take care that the laws shall faithfully be executed, shall be faithfully executed. That's the only other time where the Constitution points to this concept of somebody who's going to execute the laws. Well, what's the relationship of the President of the United States to the militia? He's the commander-in-chief of the militia. The two things tie together perfectly. The people who wrote this document didn't just take a bunch of note cards and put random ideas and shuffle them out, and then it was all integrated. So the militia was given this execute the laws of the Union function at the national level, the level of the general government. And it always had this function at the state and local level. That's why it was created in the first place. So you look at that structure and you say, well, of course this is necessary to the security of a free state, because what could be more necessary to the security of a free state than executing the laws that guarantee that freedom? Now this follows. It's all very logical. But what has Congress done? Well, for a very long period of time, from 1792 to 1903, Congress had on the books essentially the same statute for the organization of the militia. And at the state level, it tended not to be enforced. And in the Civil War, it was enforced. Obviously, they had to call up very large numbers of men. But it tended not to be enforced. The reason was because there were very few, except on the frontiers dealing with the Indians, in most of those cases, volunteers or the regular army dealt with that situation. There were no domestic homeland security problems of sufficient crisis proportions, so that people thought that the work, the effort, the expense that was going to go into functioning in the militia was worth the time and the trouble. And so they simply abnegated their responsibility, didn't show up. And they weren't fined. The thing just atrophied. What was the first state, interestingly enough, that stopped the requirement for compulsory attendance at militia meetings? You know what that was? Massachusetts. Massachusetts, of all places, right? We're in Lexington and Concord, right? Supposedly the first shot, actually the first shot was in 1772, was in Rhode Island. But typically, we're given in history books, the shot heard around the world, right? That was at Concord Bridge, North Bridge, in Massachusetts. That was in 1830-something, 31 or 32. So from 1775, well, let's say 1791, Second Amendment. 40 years, 38 years. And they had lost touch with this situation. So by 1903, the militia was more or less of a social institution. It really wasn't functioning the way it was supposed to, and Congress began a series of statutes in 1903, 1908, 1914, 1916, 1933, where this entity that we now know as the National Guard was created. And if you read those statutes, you'll see there's a lot of confusion in there because they actually start calling the militia the National Guard. By the time you get to 1933, the National Guard is actually part of the regular armed forces, which the militia never can be, because they're two separate entities. But it's interesting, if you look at the National Guard's advertising, they will always have at least once a year the reference to the Massachusetts militia of 1631 or 1632 and say, we've been doing this since then. You know, we're the modern militia, and of course they have no more relationship to the militia than I do to the royal family of Montenegro. There's no connection whatsoever. Now, it's not to denigrate the National Guard, they serve another purpose, right? But it's to recognize that this institution, which is supposed to be, according to the Constitution, necessary to the security of a free state, really does not exist in any state in this union. There are some places where it doesn't exist at all. There are some places where there are truncated versions of it. New York is one. I was talking to somebody today, maybe Texas is another. They have a Texas State Guard, which is, I think, separate from the National Guard. New York has that same type of situation. In New York, there were 60,000 people at the present time. Well, is that universal membership? That's only one neighborhood in New York City, for heaven's sake, right? Let alone universal membership. All right, so if I were looking at this from a constitutional perspective, I would say, well, I have a solution to this Homeland Security problem, and that is we need to bring these militias back up to the constitutional standard, not simply to meet the constitutional requirement, but because now we're staring down the gun barrel of a nationwide social dislocation, which can be addressed, if it can't be solved, we hope it can be solved, but it can be addressed only at the local level. It's only at the local level where you're going to know what the needs are. It's only at the local level where you're going to have the people to do the work. It's only at the local level where you're going to be capable of putting together the kinds of organizations necessary to deal with those problems. It's only at the local level where you're going to have all the information necessary. Imagine, once this information is collected at the local level, sent up through the chain to Washington, D.C., Janet Napolitano sits on it for a week or a month, and she finally comes up with some program and sends that information back down from the Department of Homeland Security. Well, it's already too late. The situation's changed, right? She's always out of step. Well, we don't have it. So in a sense, from my perspective, that's job one. Why? Because I don't think the economic situation can be cured soon enough. If I did, then I would put it as job two. Now, how is this going to be done? That's the first question. Well, it's not going to be done by waiting for Congress to do it. No. We may as well make the funeral arrangements for ourselves if we're going to wait that long. It's probably not going to be done by letting any state legislature right now do it on its own. Because at least my experience with state legislators in various places in the country, they don't understand this matter very well. They need a lot of tutoring in order to get them up to speed. And thirdly, they tend to respond in the crisis mode, right? If there's no crisis, they're not going to do it. Right? So they need first to have the crisis, well, that's coming, but then they need to have the pressure from the people to cause them to pay attention to the crisis in the right way. And that doesn't simply mean people who are organized and, calling up to do something, do something. You've got to tell them what to do. These are children. All right? I mean, literally, you've got to tell them exactly what to do. And I don't mean in the sense of, let's have a state militia in the constitutional pattern. That won't do. You've got to hand them the statute and say, this is what we want passed. You don't even have to read it, just pass it. Because most of the bills you don't read anyway, just pass it. All right? We know this will work, just pass it.